Okay, welcome back. So the question is, what exactly does Taylor's principle require? What does it mean to say that all living things deserve equal respect? And what does this require of humans? Would it be wrong to kill a wildflower on his view? Um, he considers the possible worry that killing a human would be the same thing as killing a fly on this view. Uh, but in order to understand what it requires, there's an important distinction I want to make between what we might call prima facie obligations and all things considered moral obligations. So prima facie is a Latin term that literally means at first blush, right? So a prima facie obligation is a moral obligation that we owe to others, but it can potentially be outweighed. It's not absolute. So, for example, I have a prima facie obligation to respect your right to free speech or something like that. But, of course, we can think of cases where one's right to free speech could be outweighed by other considerations. If you're yelling with a bullhorn outside my window at 4 in the morning, even though you have a prima facie right to free speech, and even though I have a obligation to respect that, this seems like a case where there are other moral considerations that might outweigh or trump your right to free speech. So, an all things considered obligation are the moral obligations that we have in a particular case, all things considered. So, for example, I have a prima facie obligation to respect your right to life. But in a particular case, if you're, I don't know, trying to kill me with a chainsaw or something, then all things considered, I perhaps do not have the obligation to refrain from using lethal force with you, right? In self-defense, I might be able to take actions that I wouldn't in other cases, right? So, in addition, we might think, for example, that we have a prima facie obligation to obey the law, right? Generally, we have a moral obligation to obey the law. But it could be that there's a particular case where there's a law that seems unjust. Think, for example, about, say, runaway slave laws. And you might think that in that case, even though there's a prima facie obligation to obey the law, there are also obligations to do other things, such as, treat people with respect. And so, all things considered, in the case of, whether or not to help a runaway slave, you might think that you do not have an all things considered obligation to obey the law, because there's extenuating circumstances, right? So how does this then apply to Taylor's view? Well, if we think about this principle that all living things deserve equal respect, part of what he's claiming is that all living things, we have a prima facie obligation to respect the survival of other living things. Now, does that mean that it would be wrong to take life in any circumstance, right? Does it mean it would be wrong to kill a fly, wrong to destroy a wildflower? Well, in part, it's going to depend. If there is some other competing moral interest at stake, then the interests of the wildflower and the interests of the fly certainly have to be taken into account. But it doesn't mean that it would necessarily be wrong to kill another living thing. But it does mean that if there were no other moral considerations, right, that we do have an obligation to respect life. It might be wrong, for example, for me to go into Yellowstone and just start destroying wildflowers just because, I don't know, I think it's fun. In that case, the destruction doesn't seem to be morally necessary. So all other things being equal, we have a duty to respect life. But there could be cases when killing a living thing is in fact morally justified. We've already mentioned cases of self-defense, but also, for example, take the pine beetle case, right, in Yellowstone, in Montana. And the pine beetles are destroying trees. So we might think that even though we have a prima facie obligation to respect the life of pine beetles, in this case, we may need to try to eradicate or exterminate pine beetles in order to save trees, right? So, and similarly, it very well could be the case that there are certain living things, so I don't know, such as a virus or bacteria, depending on whether or not you would count a virus as a living thing, but that we might think, even though it has some interest in survival, that there are other moral considerations that warrant eradicating it in this case, right? Now, if it's the case that all living things deserve equal respect, does that mean that killing a human is the same as killing a fly? Well, again, Taylor can say no. Like Singer, Taylor might argue that indeed humans have many, many interests. They have an interest in survival, but they also have an interest in other things like pursuing certain goals, communicating with others, having relationships with others, and these might also give rise to other interests. A fly has interests that deserve to be taken into account, but it's not clear that it has all of the same interests that humans do. So, killing a human might be much worse than killing a fly, in the sense that you're not only disregarding the human's right to survival, right to flourish, but you're ending the life in ways that affect other people, right, that make them sad. You're preventing the human from fulfilling certain goals and interests that they had. You're curbing a life of potential. And all of those things may carry more weight than when we kill a fly and we think, that the fly just ceases to exist, right? But again, at the same time, Taylor does want to argue that, imagine that flies weren't annoying, or mosquitoes or something like that, and imagine that they didn't carry any sorts of diseases or anything. And we just killed them just to kill them, right? Maybe it's because we, don't want anything in the air, or because we just enjoy killing things. This would be a problem on his view, right? So killing a fly, we have a prima facie moral obligation not to kill a fly, just as we do to not kill a human. But it just is the case that there may be other moral considerations that outweigh the interest of the fly in surviving. And certainly humans may have more interests and interests that carry more weight than flies. Okay, so I want to now turn to some potential objections to Taylor's view, some things to think about. One is whether or not Taylor's notion of an interest is problematic. So, like Singer, right, we must give moral consideration to those that have an interest. And Taylor thinks it's sufficient to be a living thing to have an interest in survival. But do living things, such as grass, for example, have an interest in surviving in the same way that humans have an interest in, say, having a job? I mean, when human interests are thwarted, right? Humans have interests because they are the sorts of beings, as Kant said, that can develop and pursue certain goals and aims. Now, um, you know, when those interests are thwarted, our desires are frustrated in a certain way that brings about psychological pain and in some cases even physical pain. And it can affect our relationships and our life prospects. But grass, for example, if we were going to tear out some grass to make, I don't know, a new parking lot, which I'm not saying is a good thing, but if we were to do that, you know, does the grass have an interest in surviving in the same way? Are its interests thwarted? Are its desires thwarted? I mean, grass doesn't really seem to have an interest. Now, some people will say that living things do have an interest. If you've ever noticed in the forest, right, when one tree falls over and blocks another, the other tree will grow around it, right, in ways that try to seek out light. And so you might think, the tree has an interest in light and in water and in surviving. But if the tree ends up dying, it's not clear that it really has an interest that's been thwarted or a desire that's been thwarted. It's not clear that it's the same thing as it is for humans. Okay. So one worry is that Taylor's notion of an interest is potentially problematic here. Another concern is that Taylor's principle puts a special or unfair burden on humans to curb their own interests. Obviously, wolves, for example, don't seem to have moral obligations to curb their interests in survival, and so when they kill sheep or things like that, we don't think they're morally blameworthy. But why then should humans have moral obligations to curb their own interests in relation to other living things? It seems to expect much more of humans and puts more of the burden on them than other creatures. Now, Taylor and others would probably respond to this by saying, look, humans have these burdens because they're in a unique position to be able to protect other living things, whereas other animals maybe don't have that capacity. But someone like Kant, in this case, is going to say, this is precisely why humans don't have obligations to other living things, because other living things can't participate in our system of morality the way that other humans can. Okay. And finally, there's this concern that Taylor's principle may have some counterintuitive consequences. On the one hand, he does argue that humans might have other interests than, say, those of flies. But it may very well be that there are cases where, take for example, you have a young child, a baby, and, a bear cub, and both of them are threatened by a forest fire. And you only have the opportunity to save one, right? Famous philosophy dilemma. It appears that in some way, their lives have equal value on Taylor's view, right? They both have interests in survival. Now, again, we might say in the case of the baby that, well, presumably the parents also have an interest in the baby's life, right? But it does seem that on some level, Taylor is committed to the view that all living things have equal worth and equal value, and that they all have a right to be respected. And that may lead to the consequence that, the life of a baby and the life of a bear cub are equally valuable. Now, there are many people who will think that's not a problem with the view, that's a virtue. But I will let you continue to explore that in the discussions to come.